You can't study international relations and study the history of international politics without coming face to face with this arrogance. The colonization of the rest of the world so that they can civilize the rest of the world. This is not Orthodox Christianity, not at all. When they launched their crusades, were they Christian crusades? Yes, it was a pope who launched them, but it didn't look at all like Christian crusades. No. Why? Because they were not only after Jerusalem, they had two goals they wanted. Number one was Jerusalem, and number two was Constantinople. Yes, they wanted Constantinople. They wanted Orthodox Christianity to bend its knee before Rome. You can say what you want about them, but you cannot dispute the fact that these are a people who are different from the West. That one in the West is arrogant. The arrogance of that Christianity in the West, which has allied itself with Jews in a Judeo-Christian Zionist alliance, is that it wants to transform the rest of the world into carbon copies of itself. Who are these people? وَلَنْ تَرْضَى عَنْكَ الْيَهُودَ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُمْ. They are the Western European Judeo-Christian alliance. I went to Russia, and when I went to Russia, I saw lots of beards. Oh yes, lots of beards in Russia. These are not an arrogant people. They don't want to rule the world. They don't want to transform all of mankind into carbon copies of themselves. وَلَنْ تَرْضَى عَنْكَ الْيَهُودَ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُمْ. No, that's those Christians. These Christians are different. And because Russia is not prepared to submit, and China is not prepared to submit, it's going to checkmate them, and NATO can do nothing to stop it. They're going to be checkmated. When the nuclear war takes place, because they've already declared war on Russia. If you're living in France and Britain and in Western Europe, and if you don't know that your leaders have declared war on Russia, and the nuclear war is now inevitable, and when that nuclear war takes place, that thousands of nuclear weapons will explode. If you don't know that, then you are living in dreamland.
At St. George Hall, in the Kremlin, in the midst of a crisis,
Russian losses are beginning to spark criticism of the Russian leader.
Russian officials packed the room. They knew the war in Ukraine was going badly.
Calling his actions, quote, detrimental to Russia's and its citizens' future.
Their leader was at a critical juncture.
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Putin.
Vladimir Putin would make it clear what his intentions were and who the enemy really was.
Западные страны веками твердят о том, что они несут другим народам свободу и демократию. Все с точностью да наоборот. Чужие. Диктат США строится на грубой силе, на кулачном праве.
It was a dramatic escalation. Putin leaving no doubt his war was against the United States and the West. It is a war that he has been waging for years, confronting 5 American presidents on a path that has brought Russia and the United States to the brink. during the height of the Cold War.
There is such change taking place in the communist world.
We must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy.
During the presidency of Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At the time, Vladimir Putin was a young KGB officer stationed in Germany, trained to fight the United States. For Lieutenant Colonel Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union, spurred on by an American president, was a defining moment.
In the thousands, they are here in the tens of thousands. Here the feeling is the end of the Cold War.
As we celebrate Christmas, this day of peace and hope,
the humiliation at the hands of the U.S. continued as the next American president, George H.W. Bush, declared the end of the Soviet era a triumph.
Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
Vladimir Putin sees American talk of human rights, democracy, freedom as a cynical fig leaf, something that the U.S. uses to cover itself as it cynically pursues its interests across the globe, as it pushes its agenda across the globe.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
In Moscow today, an unprecedented peaceful passing of power.
As he ascended to the presidency, Vladimir Putin was determined to restore Russian strength and empire.
Russians are looking for a strong hand to lead the country. Vladimir Putin, it appears, is their man.
He came to see himself as almost ordained to lead Russia at this moment and to lead Russia back to greatness. If that is your ordained mission, then there aren't a lot of limits on the means you can use to achieve that goal.
President Clinton arrived in Moscow carrying a message of cooperation.
As president, Putin carried his simmering grievance with the United States into his first meeting with President Bill Clinton.
Arriving at the Kremlin for their first presidential encounter, both leaders...
Two presidents, one near the end of his term, the other beginning a new era.
Putin was wary of the American president, who had championed the spread of liberalization and democracy in Russia.
If Mr. Clinton was hoping for a foreign policy triumph, he won't get it here.
Later that day, Clinton received a warmer reception from Putin's mentor, former President Boris Yeltsin. And he issued a warning about the new Russian president.
Bill Clinton looked hard into Yeltsin's eyes and said, I'm a little bit concerned about this young man that you have turned over the presidency to. He doesn't have democracy in his heart. And he reached over and poked him in his heart. And I will never forget the expression that came over Yeltsin. I think it really shook Yeltsin a bit.
But in front of the cameras, Clinton walked a careful line, not revealing his concerns about Putin.
If you want to know what my personal assessment is, I think he is fully capable of building a prosperous, strong Russia while preserving freedom and pluralism and the rule of law. It's a big challenge. I think he's fully capable of doing it.
But from the start, Clinton's private fears about Putin were being realized.
From the very beginning, you saw in Putin somebody who didn't have the values of the West. Piece by piece, he is dismantling the structures of democracy, fragile though they were, that had been put in place and reconsolidating control in the Kremlin. That's not a Westernizer. That's not a Democrat, small d. That's an old-fashioned Russian autocrat that we saw and should have seen from the very beginning.
literally one of the closest elections in American history.
It was the start of a new presidency in the U.S.
Electoral votes will go to George W. Bush, the governor of Texas.
And the winner had expressed optimism about being able to get along with Putin.
Howdy to the new president of the United States.
I look forward to working with Mr. Putin and explaining my point of view and my attitude about the post-Cold War era. I'm going to look him right in the eye and say, you're no longer the enemy. And we're not your enemy. Surely we can work together. We're a peaceful nation. And that we look forward to working together with Russia.
President George Bush has called for a new approach.
The two presidents would size each other up
Meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin
at a summit in the former communist state of Slovenia.
This is more about the president and Putin developing a personal relationship at the beginning of
Question to President Bush, is this a man that Americans can trust?
I'll answer the question. I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
And Bush gives that line, right? That I looked into his eyes and got a sense of his soul. And we go, uh-oh. And Condi does her version of not comfortable. She just reacts, just for a second.
For the moment, Putin had won over the American president.
He was trained not to reveal his so to say soul, if he has any. His life experience didn't allow him to reveal any inner him, any true him, to any representative of the West.
President, thank you. Very good job.
West, for him, remains to be the enemy. And the United States, as the leader of the West, is the enemy number one.
The countdown to war, it appears, is now underway.
And soon, more fuel for Putin's grievance with the U.S.
U.S.-led attack on Iraq appears.
The Iraq War.
America at war. Tonight, shock and awe.
Regime change at the hands of the Bush administration.
The Stars and Stripes have come to town. Saddam Hussein's reign of terror is over.
The Iraq War was absolutely a turning point in a very significant moment of rupture in the relationship between Putin and President Bush.
For Putin, echoes of the final days of the Soviet Union.
The tyrant has fallen, and Iraq is free. And everywhere that freedom stirs, let tyrants fear.
An adventure like the Iraq War shows him that, look, they'll just come in and they'll just take out a government and think nothing of it. And that's not the way he wanted the world to work.
And it is both our responsibility and our privilege to fight freedom's fight.
Bush called it the Freedom Agenda, a plan to export American democracy around the world. Putin saw it as a direct threat to his own plan to restore Russian greatness.
Vladimir Putin concluded that the United States, when possible, would use its power and leverage to depose leaders that it did not agree with. And from Vladimir Putin's perspective, that was an existential threat.
The Bush Doctrine is spreading freedom around the world.
Under Bush, that threat was extending to Putin's own backyard.
Responsibility around the world to extend freedom.
Popular uprisings in former Soviet republics.
Bush really believes that democracy can be planted almost anywhere.
Americans, respect your courageous choice for liberty. The American people will stand with you.
Putin concluded that these were efforts by the United States and our intelligence services to, in fact, install in these neighboring countries regimes that would be anti-Russian.
Putin had seen enough. He would fight back.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is speaking at an international conference in Germany.
He'd do it in Munich, Germany, issuing a warning to America and the world.
And so he comes to the security conference in Munich and says basically, I don't have to mince words, do I?
перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится? Почему же сейчас?
My head snapped. It was so searing and blunt, and I felt this was the real guy.
И это, конечно, крайне опасно. И ведет к тому, что никто уже не чувствует себя в безопасности. Я хочу это подчеркнуть. Никто не чувствует себя в безопасности.
Putin echoed Cold War rhetoric by accusing the U.S. of making the world unsafe.
Premier Vladimir Putin left no doubt who he sees as responsible for the current global crisis. Harshest attacks on America in his 7-year term.
After that speech, we saw the first long-range nuclear bombers by Russia. We did not necessarily understand that 2007 is the date where he wanted to stop that democratic encroachment.
The leaders of NATO begin a 2-day summit today.
It's been 6 years since the establishment of the NATO-Russia Council.
But Bush ignored Putin's warning.
Actions taken by this summit will affect the future of the alliance.
Ratcheting up the conflict, encouraging Georgia and Ukraine, two former Soviet republics, to join NATO.
We must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
The Russians were obviously very, very concerned that the Bush administration was moving towards allowing both Georgia and Ukraine to get into NATO, which was for them a huge red line.
Putin rushed to Bucharest to confront Bush.
There's this amazing moment. Putin shows up early and crashes the dinner with the NATO members. He has basically shown up as the skunk in the garden and challenging them for what they've done.
In a meeting later, Putin was adamant to Bush. Georgia, and especially Ukraine, were in his sphere of influence. Putin made it clear he wouldn't accept Bush's plan for Georgia and Ukraine.
It basically waved the red flag in front of the bull. It was extremely provocative for Russia. It provoked Russia and made Russia angry.
The president who had looked into Putin's soul had now reached a different conclusion about just who Vladimir Putin was. Nearing the end of his presidency, Bush would leave the increasing conflict with Putin to his successor.
All Americans can celebrate, red or blue, black or white.
First African-American president of the United States.
President Obama is set to land in Russia.
Less than a year later, Vladimir Putin would meet newly elected Barack Obama face to face,
President Obama has a big meeting ahead.
sizing up his third American president.
Shadows of the Cold War will loom over his summit. Clearly, the relationship not quite as warm as maybe it has with other world
Leaving
leaders.
Russia, the new president had another way to deal with the problem of Vladimir Putin.
Putin gave him an hour-long lecture, and I don't think Obama likes to be lectured. That was a real clash of the egos there.
President Obama has gotten to Moscow, and Putin is not buying it, and Putin is still in charge.
He gave the Putin file to his vice president, Joe Biden.
And here's Joe Biden, who's been talking about Russian issues since 1973. And they said, all right, Joe Biden, this is your issue.
A senator over 4 decades and chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Biden, like Putin, had been shaped by the Cold War.
Speaking for myself, I don't trust the Soviets. I don't trust them to do anything short of what they can get away with.
I caution against being excessively optimistic about Mr. Putin and his intentions.
Now, as vice president, Biden traveled to Moscow to meet with Putin. The two men smiled for the cameras, but later things were different. Putin argumentative,
It's in our self-interest.
Biden wary. Biden would write about the moment in his autobiography.
It was long and contentious. Putin was ice-cold calm throughout, but argumentative from the start to finish. I'm looking into your eyes, I told him, smiling. I don't think you have a soul. He looked at me for a second and smiled back. We understand each other, he said. And we did.
And Biden wasn't done. In front of students, he urged the Russian people to stand up to Putin's regime.
The Russian people want to live in a country that fights corruption. So I urge all of you students here, don't compromise on the basic elements of democracy. You need not make that Faustian bargain.
For Putin to see an American vice president go talk to students and encourage democracy, he sees it as a threat. Who are you to come here and foment trouble in my backyard? It's aggravating and offensive to Putin to see that kind of action.
And later that year, protesters right outside the Kremlin. It looked like what Biden had been calling for.
Tens of thousands came out on the streets to tell Vladimir Putin they'd had enough.
There's hundreds of thousands of people who were marching the streets of Moscow, shouting down with Putin. For him, it was like, it couldn't be so, it couldn't happen.
Putin extended his offensive beyond Russia.
Ukraine is stuck very much in the middle.
In the Ukrainian territory of Crimea.
Armed Russian troops arrived in the Crimea region.
His campaign began with the arrival of unmarked Russian soldiers.
They moved in with what the Ukrainians called little green men, and they were clearly, by the way they handled themselves and their weapons, professional military.
Forces in the thousands seizing territory. Sovereign territory that belongs to Ukraine.
He seized Crimea and said it was now part of Russia.
That kind of aggression is not something we should tolerate anywhere in the world.
At the White House, President Obama was struggling to respond.
President Obama says he's deeply concerned about
On the phone, Obama confronted Putin about his forces in Ukraine. Inside the administration, Vice President Biden urged a tough response. CIA Director John Brennan also wanted to get tough. Officials at the Pentagon and State Department joined with Biden. They advocated arming Ukraine with Javelin anti-tank missiles. Biden lost. Instead of weapons, Obama went with sanctions.
President Trump's Helsinki summit with President Vladimir Putin.
For the fourth time, Vladimir Putin would confront a new American president.
Urging the president to confront Putin about Russia's interference in the 2016 election.
Well, first of all, Mr. President, I'd like to congratulate you on a really great World Cup. That getting along with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing.
The cameras were sent away. For 2 hours, they met privately, without any aides. Afterwards, when they faced the press, a shocking statement.
President Putin denied having anything to do with the election interference in 2016. Every U.S. intelligence agency has concluded that Russia did. My first question for you, sir, is who do you believe?
My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be.
Extraordinary moment in American history, something I thought I would never see.
It's a disgraceful play by the President of the United States as he stood by Vladimir Putin.
Back in Washington,
Concern continues to grow about what they said to each other behind closed doors.
they were calling it a bromance.
Been some sort of romance with
Putin-Trump romance.
President Trump on the attack, asking, what good is NATO?
Once again questioning the entire point to one of America's oldest alliances.
And Trump was echoing Putin's talking points on the key battleground of Ukraine.
The president told leaders that, quote, Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
The president is saying that Crimea probably should belong to Russia because everyone there speaks Russian.
Crimea is Russian. Everybody there speaks Russian and wants to be part of Russia.
Trump suggested it's pointless to continue punishing Russia.
The Fox News decision desk can now project that former Vice President Joe Biden
And with a new president,
elect Joseph Robinette Biden.
Frankly, we did win this election.
an escalation of the chaos in America that Putin helped foment.
The president showing no signs that he's prepared to concede this election. Instead,
Division,
This is a contested election. Many people are nervous.
Violence. Insurrection.
January 6th, apart from anything else, leads directly to the war in Ukraine. Because it looks like America is not just morally discredited, it looks like America is weak.
Historic meeting with Russian President Vladimir
Soon in Geneva, Vladimir Putin faced his old nemesis.
President Biden and Vladimir Putin.
Now the President of the United States.
For neither of them is this their first rodeo.
The tensions seem to be a bit high.
Putin is looking at Biden and saying, this is a weak American president. He doesn't have the overwhelming support of his public. His people are so divided. Just months earlier, they'd had an attack on the Capitol. And all he needs to do is hold Biden off long enough so that he can continue to assemble the plan that he's putting together.
They're children of the Cold War, and they see each other and their countries through the Cold War. Biden saw Putin for what he is, a KGB revanchist who wants to remake the Russian Empire.
I mean, these are two people who do not like each other.
Antony Blinken, now Secretary of State, was once again in the room.
The tone of the conversation was professional, it was direct, but it was very clear where we had our differences. President Biden made very clear where we saw things differently, and so did President Putin.
Try to determine where we have mutual interests.
A top priority for Biden, deterring Putin in Ukraine.
President Biden made clear in the meeting to President Putin our commitment to Ukraine, our commitment to its sovereignty, to its independence, to its territorial integrity.
They wanted to park Putin, but he didn't want to be parked. Number one priority, the number one threat, the number one problem that the White House was dealing with.
Putin began laying the groundwork for the invasion of Ukraine.
And 100,000 Russian troops near Ukraine's border are fueling fears of a
Russian forces start moving back toward Ukraine's borders.
Heavy military equipment clearly taking in. Russian troops had been surrounding Ukraine for days now.
Ukraine border with Belarus. Ukraine border with Russia. Ukraine border with occupied Crimea.
Satellite images show an increase in Russian forces on the Ukraine border.
At the White House,
Tensions nearing a tipping point.
an emergency presidential briefing. Secret information about Putin's plans. Once again, an American president was facing a critical decision about how to deal with Putin. In a video conference with Putin, Biden warned him to pull back from the brink.
He's saying, first of all, we see what you're doing, what you're planning, what you're plotting, and if you go ahead with what we're seeing, you need to understand the costs and consequences to Russia will be severe, and you need to know that I mean what I say.
Putin's response was familiar: denial.
They're denying any imminent aggression against Ukraine. They're saying that that's not what we're doing. But because we had such extraordinary visibility and extraordinary information, we knew in real time when Putin was saying something that was in contradiction with what was actually happening.
Putin ignored Biden and pushed forward with the invasion. For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin had defied American presidents, invading Georgia, seizing Crimea, interfering in a presidential election. And he wasn't stopping now. 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin was now pursuing an all-out war to rebuild the Russian Empire.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Apocalyptic scenes on the outskirts of the capital city.
Biden went further than any president before, delivering weapons and intelligence to the front lines to help fight Putin. Vladimir Putin, the former KGB agent, now a dangerous pariah on the world stage. staring down yet another American president to see how far he will go.
Ahead of a looming energy crisis this winter as Vladimir Putin cuts off the continent's natural gas supply.
Putin is counting on the fact that the Western powers are just going to lose interest in Ukraine.
How much longer the United States can continue to help bankroll this war.
Will Ukraine ultimately be left to fight this war on its own?
С начальных классов детям навязывали извращения, которые ведут к деградации и вымиранию. Чтобы им вдалбливали, что кроме женщины и мужчины якобы существуют еще некие гендеры. И предлагали сделать операцию по смене пола. Но разве мы все этого хотим для своей страны и для своих детей? Для нас все это неприемлемо. У нас другое, свое будущее. Повторю, диктатура западных элит направлена против такое полное отрицание человека, неспровержение веры и традиционных ценностей. Подавление свободы приобретает черты религии наоборот, откровенного сатанизма. Агрессивные информационные атаки. Целью выбирают прежде всего, конечно, молодых людей, молодые поколения. И здесь опять лгут постоянно, извращают исторические факты, не прекращают нападки на нашу культуру, на русскую православную церковь, другие традиционные религиозные организации нашей страны. Посмотрите, что они делают со своими собственными народами. Разрушение семьи, культурной и национальной идентичности, извращение, издевательства над детьми вплоть до педофилии объявляются нормой их жизни. Хочется им сказать, но посмотрите, извините меня, священное писание, главные книги всех других мировых религий. Там все сказано, в том числе то, что семья – это союз мужчины и женщины. Но и эти священные тексты подвергаются сейчас сомнению. Но вот, как стало известно, англиканская церковь, например, планирует, правда, пока только еще, рассмотреть идею гендерно-нейтрального Бога. Что тут скажешь? Прости, Господи, не ведают, что творят. Западные коллеги, особенно из США, не просто устанавливают произвольно такие правила, но и поучают при этом, кто и как должен их исполнять, кто и как должен вообще себя вести. Делается и говорится это все, как правило, в откровенно хамской форме. Это все то же самое проявление вот этого колониального мышления. Все время мы слышим, все время звучит: вы должны, вы обязаны, мы вас серьезно предупреждаем. Вы кто такие вообще? Какое вы имеете право кого-то предупреждать? Пора все-таки избавиться от этого мышления эпохи колониального владычества. Хочется, так сказать, протрите глаза. Эта эпоха давно закончилась и никогда больше не вернется. Никогда. Наше понимание цивилизации совершенно иное. Во-первых, цивилизаций много. И ни одна из них не лучше и не хуже другой. Они равноправны, как выразители чаяний своих культур и традиций, своих народов. Наши собеседники на Западе, кажется, вообще забыли, что существуют такие понятия, как разумные самоограничения, компромиссы, готовность в чем-то уступать ради достижения приемлемого для всех результата. Нет, они буквально одержимы только одним – продавить. Именно продавить, причем любой ценой, здесь и сейчас свои интересы. Если это их выбор, посмотрим, что из этого получится.